Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here to speak on the blue humanities. And I hope that everybody has enough of caffeine to overdo these last minutes of today. I will try to give my best. Everything flows. The necessity of blue humanities. The oceans alone make up 2/3 of the Earth's surface. More than half of all Earth's inhabitants live near the coast, and humans are made up of around 60% of water. Nevertheless, the knowledge about water as a natural substance was and still is limited. The US-American environmental activist and president of the Blue Frontier campaign, David Halbach, pointed out, on behalf of the oceans, that more is still known about the dark side of the moon than about the deep sea. This exaggeration is, on the one hand, a call for more attention for saving the world's oceans, which are increasingly polluted by so-called slow violence and massively threatened by species extinction. On the other hand, it points out to a complex, initially paradoxical deficit in terms of water knowledge. Although there is a great deal of culturally handed down knowledge, it has often led to emotionalized metaphorizations or stereotypes, or has even fallen into oblivion. The cultural knowledge is still thought of separately from the scientific knowledge and technical innovations that have been gained in the meantime. This gap affects not only the salt water of the oceans, but also the much smaller quantities of fresh and drinking water, of what we have been talking about a lot, which, due to increasing scarcity and privatization attempts, threatens to become the oil of the 21st century. It is also paradoxical that more and more people are simultaneously suffering from water shortages and from water overuse. The association of the color blue with water is not only based on observation, but also acts as a metaphor, just like the talk of waves and floods. As in other cultural fields and epistemic practices, not only the anthropocentric, but also the Eurocentric, and in case of the oceans, the Atlantic-centered view, proved to be very limited when dealing with water. And finally, humans, like all land creatures, are connected to water due to their existential and practical need for life, while at the same time being separated from it. From a categorical perspective, water is initially non-human or more than human, which is why water studies appear to be similar to plant or animal studies. And yet, humans can never have sovereignty over water. Although water can be either an annoying or a beneficial companion, for example, during downpour of it or a dip in the river, water is first and foremost not a species, but a primordial substance that is necessary for survival and makes all life possible in the first place, or threatens it in its absence or excess. That is the reason why water studies, or blue humanities, are also associated with elemental eco-criticism, which deals with all four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. My talk is structured in 5 parts: knowing water, blue turn against Atlantic centrism, water, spaces and gender, and writing water and thinking water. Knowing water. Our knowledge about water, about the chemical compound of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, the knowledge about its physical properties and biological significance, supplemented by specialized knowledge from subjects such as hydrotechnology, hydroenergetics, hydrobiology, hydrometeorology, etc. All this knowledge cannot be grasped by any individual. Since water, as a natural substance, occurs in almost all sciences and techniques, or establishes specific regions of knowledge and practice, Hartmut Böhme called it called in his 1988 outline of a cultural history of water for an interdisciplinary approach to the omnipresence of water. In a conference in 1988, he made a first attempt based on natural philosophy in theological, literary, art, and social history terms. By reviving and analyzing the mythopoetic history of water, he attempts to dismantle the objectivation demanded by the natural sciences and technology and the resulting alienation of the element, and to bring to mind that man, with his water-related practices, is always the actor, and since he is involved in the water cycles, always also the affected party. Apart from a few individual studies, Burmeskol has only recently, a good 35 years later, received a corresponding response in the course of the environmental humanities. Yet water has shaped cultural and intellectual history from the very beginning. Even in ancient times, water was seen as a resource for building and maintaining civilizations and as a symbol of fertility, purity, and power. The natural philosopher Thales regarded water as the primordial source from which everything originates. Empedocles spoke of the harmony in which all elements are connected. The knowledge of water handed down over the centuries owes much to ancient or biblical traditions and myths, as well as the growing interest in the visual arts and literature. Water appears as a symbol of life, but also of death and danger, as well as of change and transformation. Later also as a mirror of emotions, as a symbol of purification and renewal, and again as a force of destiny and nature. Whether in Homer's Odyssey or in the Gilgamesh epic, in the biblical flood, later in Herman Melville's Moby Dick or Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, threatening water worlds are often in the central settings of world literature. A psychological revolution of the water worlds, which are often threatening for humans and declared to the sublime, begins in the Romantic period. Elemental spirits operate at the limits of the human. The depth and inaccessibility of water corresponds to the unconscious. Deep sea images have symbolic potential in the same way as dreams. For authors with an affinity for drugs such as Thomas de Quincey, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, or Edgar Allan Poe, the depths of the sea are mind-expanding and even existentially threatening. The narrator of Poe's A Descent in the Maelstrom, caught up in the whirlpools, can only save himself through logical, mathematical calculation. The process of modernization, domestication, and exploitation of nature is, unsurprisingly, accompanied by three dominantly negative connotations of water. Catastrophes associated with the element of water respond to the destructive potential of modern man with a correspondingly massive abundance, since this fluidal element, due to the organic, processual, and metamorphic that characterizes it, excludes any graspability and controllability and shakes the supposedly constant and stable foundation of the modern worldview from the ground up. Innovative developments, such as the creation of seaside reports, the laying of transatlantic telecommunication cables, or experimentation with deep-sea passages, find their way into literature. Water scenarios, in particular, increasingly serve to test the limits of human experience, which have been spelled out in contemporary science or climate fiction. One example which I want to present you is a German one. It is called Das Wasser, the Water, of Katrin Rögler, which was commissioned by the Theater of the Anthropocene, which is in Berlin, and tells of current flood disasters. It bears witness to the power attributed to water or its inhabitants, to which people are powerless and often speechless. Here you see how this is departed. It has 5 pictures. The first picture is the flood, then the second picture, affluence, abundance, the third, groundwater, the fourth is drought, and the fifth is the sea. Films are also effectively staged attempts to reconquer the water or struggle for survival in and with it or its inhabitants, in which the perspectives of victim and perpetrator vary. While in Steven Spielberg's Jaws, the great white shark threatens humans, in Free Willy, the domesticated orca is freed by a boy. Luc Besson's Le Grand Bleu deals with the danger of deep-sea diving, while Ang Lee's film adaptation of the philosophical novel Life of Pi is about the survival of 2 shipwrecked men, a boy and a tiger. The Kenyan science fiction short film Pumzi of 2009 by Vanuri Kahiu depicts life in a post-apocalyptic world in drought, almost without water. The variety of representations of water in art cited here as examples that show that socio-historical classifications into cosmological age in which miracle healers and magicians instrumentalized water for their purposes, a Christian age in which water became a cleansing agent, but also acquired erotic and sexual connotations, and finally a scientific age, fall far too short to grasp the phenomenon. Not least because of its fluidity, water is difficult for us to grasp. In order to understand the phenomenon as comprehensively as possible, knowing water, scientific and technical measuring and testing is not enough. Rather, the ways in which we think about water, thinking water, and write water, writing water, need to be reconsidered. This is what the so-called water studies, which study water in a transdisciplinary and transcultural way, are trying to do in order to bring the traditional and the new into dialogue, to establish connections, and by crossing borders, to gain new, one could say, in accordance with the color attributed to color, blue knowledge. In the course of the increasing examination of environmental issues in the humanities, a new turn, an internal turn, so to speak, can be observed within the environmental turn, which no longer understands water merely as part of the land's environment, but places it and its diverse formations at the center of attention. In the context of this blue turn, for example, the inexhaustible reservoir of water symbolism from the long mythopoetic history of water is being examined philosophically, culturally, and in the humanities against the backdrop of the threat to the blue planet, with the inclusion of knowledge from the natural and technical sciences. Water, which is actually transparent but is perceived as blue, partly due to its effect under a blue sky or when viewed from space, gives its name to the research field based on it. The fact that the color blue has played a special role since the Romantic period also adds to the poetic appeal of the term blue humanities, under which most of this research is now conducted. Initially, the turn towards the sea and the cultural practices associated with it, since Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us, was referred to as the cultural turn to the sea, but also as the oceanic turn or the new thalassology. Further specification in the philosophical, literary, historical, and cultural studies disciplines took place under the names water studies, poetics of planetary water, or hydro-humanities, or in contrast to green theory as blue cultural studies as blue theory, or early on, and probably most comprehensively, as blue humanities. I show you here the content of the book Contemporary Literary and Cultural Theory to show you how many different kind of approaches we have in these fields, and where there is now in Jeffrey DeLeo's book, I think it's from 2024, the blue humanities. In contrast to the green approaches based on land, the stated ocean imperative not only resulted in new mappings based on water rather than land. With reference to the Spillhouse projection by the oceanograph Ethelham Spillhouse in 1942, which focuses not on the land but on the connected oceans, the focus shifted to water, which already dominates in terms of area. This reversal was followed by new readings, initially of canonical texts such as John Peck in Maritime Fiction, Margaret Cohen in The Novel and the Sea, or Steve Menz in Sailing Without Ahab, Ecopoetic Travels. Initially, the focus was on the oceanic, whereby a distinction had to be made as to whether, from a cultural anthropological perspective, the ocean was to be understood as alien matter, as an alien ocean, since humans could never be at home in it, or whether the sea was to be elevated to the paradigm of a metaphor for existence, and the ship moving in it was to correspond to the complex conditions of our life world on a small scale. Soon, however, ocean studies became centered on the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean. This has since been criticized, and the reference areas have widened. That means they are less focused on Western ideas of the sea. That means less centralized, more global, and more multilingual. Other cultures are included, including indigenous cultures from Oceania, for example, which have a different understanding of the sea due to their geographical location, and also look back on different cultural practices. These developments include historiographical Black Atlantic and post-colonial Caribbean studies, which, among other things, trace the history of colonization and slavery by sea. For example, the image of the Indian Ocean that had prevailed until then was exposed as a colonial fantasy. Images such as those of the romantic South Seas are increasingly losing their supposed magic. Here too, the insight into the limitations of any view of the world, and thus also of any kind of canon, and the necessity of its regular revision or expansion, including through new, modified appropriations of traditional perspectives, has a disguising effect. Comparative works, just as the juxtaposition of Craig Santos' Paris Praise Song for Oceania and Shakespeare's The Tempest, are certainly horizon-expanding, but must also be viewed critically in post-colonial terms. The Caribbean poet and literary theorist Edouard Glissant, for example, pointed out that the other is not necessarily comprehensible and should be left in this opacity, as otherwise it threatens to be subject to hegemonic attempts at categorization once again. Comparisons between the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, for example, are also unhelpful, as the former is a concentrated body of water enclosed by land, while the Caribbean is a sea that explodes the scattered lands into an arc. In this sense, the respective literary traditions, or multilingual relations in Glissant's sense, whether Mediterranean, Atlantic, Caribbean, or Indian, are not really comparable, let alone comprehensible. However, the incomprehensibility that also results from the interconnectedness, the cultural creolization, and the lack of knowledge should not be seen as a threat, but rather as a necessary and also productive condition for living together in a globalized world in which the complexity, mixing, and hybridity of identities and cultures should be recognized. When transferred back to the real oceans, lakes, rivers, swamps, rain, etc., these phenomena, which are very often threatening in reality, could perhaps be seen not only as a threat, but also as a potentially productive, transformative element through their artistic representations. Beyond the ocean fixation, the concept of planetary water now also includes smaller seas containing saltwater, freshwater resources like rivers, lakes, groundwater, rain puddles, ice formations such as polar ice caps, ice seas, ice rain, and water vapor such as haze, fog, clouds, or maybe even smog like here. Water is therefore considered in its various temperature-dependent aggregate states and no longer just in a specific geographical area. With the emergence of coastal studies, however, marginal water areas are also included in the analysis, such as coastal areas and shores, islands and estuaries preferred by humans. The aim is still to clarify the relations between humans and water in all its manifestations and transitional areas. It is repeatedly emphasized that although humans are dependent on clean water in various respects and are also attracted by its violence, beauty, changeability, and malleability, it stands alongside others as the basis of life and is not an option as a habitat. Beyond the geographical and material occurrence of water, the interplay of water and space also brings up for discussion cognitive scientific concepts of water, such as water as substance, as a means, as space, as a cultural and economic good, and their significance for the structuring of knowledge and the resulting thought and evaluation schemes. In the distinction between water as space and space as water, a distinction is made between geometric, physical, and cognitive water spaces. That means water spaces constituted by perception, thought, and language, in which psychological, symbolic, and metaphorical attributions always interact. Cognitive water spaces can also be defined as follows: topologically, like location, environment, boundary, and extent; dimensionally, the direction, distance, and extent; and relationally, outside and inside. Marginal zones such as coasts and regions defined by the inclusion of waters such as islands or even ships, and their sinking scenarios such as shipwrecks, can also be spatially defined and examined as places where social and societal actions are negotiated. Another aspect is the attribution of gender, the life-giving and life-sustaining function, but also the life-threatening dimension of water connected with the idea of a protective motherliness on the one hand and that of femininity and sexuality on the other. The idea of the material as a potentation of the feminine is closely linked to the oceanic, which is based on a similar ambivalence of fertility and devouring as the idea of Mother Earth, Gaia. However, the link between femininity and water, which has been intensified since the early Romantic period and which not least served the cultural self-positioning of men, has since been relativized. Rod Giblet's critique of masculinist and imperialist drainage of material, but also metaphorical swamp or wetlands, marginal and riparian zones, points in a similar direction. Literary texts, works of arts, films, but also epistemic practices can reveal new ways of thinking and writing about water. Here, the terrestrial bias is increasingly being called into question, in which previous concepts are questioned that are subject to the tradition of the humanities and its land-based ontologies and classifications. One approach emerges from the material eco-criticism, which examines the interaction of bodies, things, elements, substances, landscapes, etc. with humans. For example, the question of how water makes its way through the landscape or the textual landscape. Melody Jew's approach, which attempts to understand the ocean itself as a media environment, shows that it is not only artists who are exploring new water paths, but also researchers. She not only analyzes various forms of water art, but also designs new research approaches from the water that enable thinking through water. Another way of thinking about water beyond previous categories, such as space and time, is trans-scalar thinking and the associated change in perception of water. In terms of modernism, different types of water writing can be observed, whereby writing about water, reading water, and water poetics can be distinguished from flowing language, fluid meanings, water voices, and visual water poetry. Examples of this would be Christian Morgenstern's Fischer's Nachtgesang, the nightly song of a fish, or Guillaume Apollinaire's Lettres Océans. Underwater sculptures like this by Jason DeCare Taylor at Granada are also concerned with the idea of medial transgression. So if poetologies of water are frequently observed in modernism, they are not an exclusive phenomenon of a particular epoch, but are also repeatedly reworked in more recent times, such as Franz Josef Czernin's water sonnets in his volume Elemente Sonette, Elements Sonnets. What is new, however, is the way in which these can be explored with the help of water studies or blue humanities, and, as a result, possibly even gain an altered and changing view of the blue planet. As in all areas of environmental humanities, the environmental and therefore often eco-activist impetus of global climate change also plays a major role in the blue humanities. Beyond the question of the extent to which science can also be politically or even activist motivated, it remains to be seen how findings will reach readers outside of science and whether literary and cultural theory can make the threat to the blue planet comprehensible at all, and thus make a real contribution to protecting precarious waters. The prospect of transition from eco-criticism to eco-activism calls up some of the more general questions that have been raised. Can literary and cultural theory save the planet? And if so, how? Asks Steve Menz. So, to what extent, and I come to my conclusion question, to what extent this also requires a blue humanity? That means a sense of connectedness conveyed by artists as one of the research desiderata of the blue humanities. Thank you very much.